Hello, everyone. I'm Keith Destone with the Center for Hellenic Studies, and I'm here, as usual, with Greg Nagy, and with Sarah and Elaine. And we're here for office hours for HeroesX. This is the 16th version of HeroesX, and we are discussing the responses to the questions, Greg, that you posed for hours 3 and hour 4. So the hour 3 question is as follows, and it sounds very simple. How is Andromache like Cleopatra? How is she not like Cleopatra? But there's a lot to discover in those questions. What are people saying about them?
Yes, we have many beautiful answers. And one of them is the participant is writing, what I find particularly interesting is how Cleopatra and Andromache differ in their display of lament, where Andromache loses her control, as seen by the unveiling of her hair in the story Phoenix Tales. Cleopatra is only crying as she supplicates Meleagros.
Beautiful. Well, of course, one problem here is that the narrative of Old Man Phoenix is so compressed that we don't know the details of Cleopatra's crying. All we know is that she cried. And you know my functionalist definition of lament, which is crying while you sing, singing while you cry. But that still leaves a lot of details unspoken. Still, it's a very good point that our participant has made, that at least in the case of Cleopatra, the reference to lament is about as compressed as you can get.
Another difference that someone has picked up on is that Andromache is asking for Hector to stay with her, not to go out and fight. Whereas Cleopatra is asking Meleagros for the exact opposite: go out and fight, help us. Yes, that's so. It's so true, and this is a problem for Hector throughout the Iliad as we have it, which is that he is programmed to be defensive and not offensive as a warrior. He is programmed even by his name, which means he who holds back the enemy, to be somebody who defends Troy and does not venture out of the city walls and, shall we say, outperform his destined role, which his own speaking name gives him. So an intelligent lament will always give a good characterization, whether it's idealized or realistic, about whoever is being lamented. And I would say Andromache, master of lament that she is certainly very aware that Hector's role should not be to go out and attack the Achaeans, but to defend the Trojans from within. So all that is quite well observed, and the contrast here with Meleagros or Meleager, there's so many ways of pronouncing it, is very sharp. That's a very good observation. However, I might add that the more I look at the first of Andromache's 3 laments, the more I think it's the first one that's the most complicated, because in a sense it's previewing what's going to happen, which requires, again, a great deal of, may I put it this way, intelligence on the part of the agent of lament, or in this case, the master narrator who is channeling the agent of lament. And the more I think about it,
I do now think that Hector himself, the character of Hector in Iliad 6, participates in the lament by supplementing it, by saying things that a lamenting woman could be saying, but he's the one who's saying it. So in a way, he's lamenting for himself. And in a way, although he understands what his role should be, he also doesn't understand it, which again is something that I'm thinking about more and more these days, is how any given character at any given time in the Homeric Iliad isn't sure of his or her role yet. And only we can be sure, we, the listeners who are going to go through the whole thing, Iliad 1 through 24, who sometimes have intuitions about what will happen, or are ourselves just as surprised maybe about the eventualities as the characters are.
So would that be related to their seasonality?
Yes. It's yet another example of the unseasonality of the hero. They're just not on time in getting it. And by the time they get it, it's usually too late.
You mentioned the meaning of Hector's name. And our participants have also been thinking about meanings of names, and was perhaps slightly surprised to find out the meaning of Andromache's name. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I do think that if we saw earlier Andromaches, that is to say, if I imagine Homeric poetry evolving over at least 1,000 years, I would say earlier Andromaches would be more Amazon-like, because I can't get around it. Andromache seems to mean she who fights men, which is a generic role of Amazons. And after all, there is that strange mention in our Iliad of an Amazon that the Trojans seem to be worshiping as a cult hero. So Amazons are downplayed in our version of the Iliad. And so I think the Amazon-like characteristics of Andromache herself are downplayed. But they're traces, I think, how she understands what kind of nutrients the war horses of Hector need. Wow, that's really being adept at warfare, isn't it?
And doesn't she talk about, well, if you are going out to fight, keep an eye on that part of the wall. It's been breached before.
Yes, and she's the perfect defensive strategist. And after all, fighting men can be defensive fighting as well as fighting on the offensive.
Wonderful. Let's go to question 4, or the question for hour 4, and the responses there too. Here's the question. If you have developed a liking for Achilles as you read more and more of the Iliad, what new thing would you still need to see if you want to like him even more? And here's the counterpoint to that question, which probably applies to more people. Alternatively, if you have already developed a dislike for him, would there be any new thing about him that could possibly turn you around so that you would actually start to like him?
Yes.
It's the eternal problem with us,
Isn't there more at stake
current
there?
readers.
Yes, there's much more at stake when it comes to the second part of that question. Yeah.
Aylan, what are people saying?
One of them says that the wild, imaginative tour de force of the Iliad is so totally captivating, and it is, after all, Achilles, around whom the narrative swirls. But could Achilles take personal responsibility for what is happening instead of pleading the will of Zeus?
Well, he does take personal responsibility eventually. By the time Patroclus died, let's fast forward, he blames himself. and what a burden on um, the earth, the surface of the earth he is, because he himself is so burdened with sorrow and regret. And you wonderful speakers of French have this wonderful word, which in English doesn't quite capture the aspect of deep mourning. And I'm talking about the word regret. You want to meditate on that, dear Hélène, since you know also quite well, of course, the musical background of the French word, the French word that corresponds to the English regret.
Yes.
There are these amazing. I'm sorry I interrupted, but these amazing early French compositions where lament is regret, like Le Tombeau des Regrets.
Le Tombeau des Regrets, oui. Exactement.
Oh my goodness, it's so beautiful, so beautiful. I'm sorry, dear Sarah, I interrupted you.
No worries. A couple of people are saying that yes, they dislike Achilles. They're trying to get an understanding of why the ancient Greeks didn't. So the sort of thing they're talking about are, okay, he does develop as a character. Some of the things he does are things very much to dislike that were normal at the time, warriors sacking cities and abducting women, enslaving men, and the horrors of war. But that perhaps to an ancient Greek, these wouldn't make sense. These reasons wouldn't make sense. But I think there's a couple of people who said they prefer the Trojans, the women, Hector, to Achilles. Would that have made sense to an ancient Greek? Because the Trojans are portrayed quite sympathetically, I think.
Well, in the book, Homer the Classic, and in the follow-up, Homer the Preclassic, because I was going backward in time, I was worried about that. I can't even talk anymore about ancient Greeks because they're Greeks and they're Greeks. And in the case of Athens, even imperial Athens, and the imperial side of democratic Athens was not a pretty picture in many ways. There's nevertheless a pronounced sympathy for Hector primarily and for the Trojans generally. And that includes, of course, especially Hector's father, who becomes such a beautiful exponent of male lament by the time we reach Iliad 24. And a friend once pointed out to me that the elites of Athens, not in the classical period, but in the pre-classical period, you see this trend more there than later, would even give their kids names of Trojans, like Priam. Why would you call your son Priam if you're an Athenian? And in a way, doesn't that help those of you who are engaged with thinking about Roman epic, especially Virgil's Aeneid, where, after all, the sympathy definitely goes in the direction of the Trojans and not in the direction of the Achaeans. One last thing, it amazes me that in the 4th century, when the Athenian statesman Lycurgus is presenting a public discourse about what Kleos is and what it is to die for a higher ideal, it's pretty clear that he's thinking primarily of Hector and not of Achilles. So when it comes to reception of the values that you see operating in our Iliad, the values of the Trojans can be just as admirable, and may I put it this way, just as Greek as the values of the Achaeans. And it didn't help for Athenians that their mortal enemy, the Spartans, identified with the Achaeans as much as they did.
Awkward. Well, someone's commented that reading about Achilles makes a refreshing change from these, almost cardboard cutout stereotypical, quote, good heroes, and the fact that he makes mistakes, and so that makes him more relatable. And they said also that they would like to know more about his past, and so we're very much focusing on the Iliad, but it's part of a longer tradition, and there would have been stories about Achilles pre the narrative of the Iliad and post as well. So
Yeah.
What evidence have we got about those traditions if people want to read further?
This is such a beautiful question, and I think we might almost exceptionally take a little more time talking about this and maybe extend this particular meeting by just a few more minutes, because I have some observations that are pressing on my mind about this. One of them is, why am I asking our participants to read Sappho when they are reading Sappho? It's because here's an amazing female intellect, can I put it that way? And an amazing female voice of artistry. And for somebody like that, let's call her Sappho, which I'm convinced means sister. If for some mentality like that, a female mentality, to think of Achilles as the most eligible, and may I use a kind of vulgar word, sexy, that way of looking at Achilles is so shocking, I think, to many of us readers, don't you think? And why would Sappho think of Achilles as the sexiest hero alive, then alive? So that's one thing. But second thing, I want to talk a little bit more about that beautiful observation that you were channeling from our participant about how Achilles is a killing machine. If he is, if even before the Trojan War, he has captured 12 cities one way and 11 cities another way. Imagine all the bloodshed, all the mayhem, all the suffering. It's beyond imagination. And yet, by the time we get to Iliad 9, he's comparing himself to a mother bird caring about the nestlings. Wow, what's going on? Or when Patroclus is trying to appeal to Achilles, you've got to do something about your suffering comrades. Maybe we should talk about this later, but this question is so timely. Let me talk about it now. So, dear friends, if we can extend this conversation for maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds, I think of that moment where Achilles is saying, why are you crying, Patroclus? Why are you weeping when you're imploring me to get over my rage and help my comrades? Why, you're like a little girl who's tugging at the apron strings of her mother, saying, pick me up, pick me up, pick me up. That's not quite the way he says it, but this intuitive moment where a little girl is tugging at her mother's dress, pick me up, was brought to life for me by a colleague whose observations I was reading, where what this seems to be referring to, and I'm almost done, it is horrific scenes of war crimes where a community is captured, and then the soldiers who are force marching the captives, who would be mostly women and children and some old men, would be, and I think the English expression is harrying this miserable group of potential slaves who are being force marched to the region of their captors. And harrying means that if there's anybody weak during this force march and is flagging in strength, that's a horrific way to apply the principle of survival of the fittest. So you want the fittest slaves. And so people drop off during these forced marches. And there's documentation of this, especially in Hittite texts, which are texts that are very accurate descriptions of what society could be in the second millennium before our era, some of the horrors of society. To make a long, grim story short, can you imagine in that situation a little girl who's on a forced march with her mother and saying, "Mommy, pick me up. Please pick me up." And what does the mother do? If she picks her up, they're probably even more definitively doomed, that they'll be dropped off. They'll drop off and be killed by the harrying soldiers. And as the forced march goes on, it's to me so heartbreaking. And here's Achilles, who's thinking about things like this. That doesn't make me like him more, but there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, just to mention, because you mentioned Le Tombeau des Regrets a little bit earlier, and there is this beautiful movie, Tous les matins du monde.
I love it. I love that movie.
Yeah, with the music of Jean de Colombe and the beautiful pieces, Le Tombeau des Regrets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
All the regrets of the past. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, that character, when you look at the history, it is true that he was the one who added the seventh string to the viol, that particular instrument, which makes it an even more classical instrument. And I think of the lyre that Achilles plundered when he raided one of these cities. And that song by Roberta Flack, strumming my pain with his fingers. I'm just saying, killing me softly. Mm. Wow, I could go on and on. This is such a beautiful moment for us to contemplate just the sorrows of life. And that even somebody we may not like understands the sorrows now and then.
As you've said, Greg, in other contexts, epic is not just an action movie, but it's a medium that requires an emotional response or investment.
Oh, yes. Wait till we get to the Odyssey. We'll see a lot of regrets, dear Hélène, right?
Yes. Indeed.
A lot of regrets. Mm.
Well, I won't regret resuming our conversation next week with hours 5 and 6. So thank you again, friends, for joining us. And see you next time.